When 17-year-old troublemakers thought they could humiliate the quiet new substitute teacher, they had no idea they were about to face someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. What happened next would change everything at Jefferson High School forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Thompson adjusted her simple black blazer and smoothed down her shoulder-length auburn hair as she stood outside the main office of Jefferson High School in Millbrook, Tennessee. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for timidity. Her clothes were modest and unremarkable, a white button-down shirt, dark slacks, and sensible flats that made no sound as she walked. Everything about her appearance was carefully chosen to blend in. To avoid drawing attention, the principal, Dr. Helen Rodriguez, emerged from her office with a warm but slightly frazzled expression. Jefferson High had been struggling with substitute teachers all semester, and finding someone willing to take on long-term assignments was becoming increasingly difficult. Ms. Thompson, thank you so much for coming in on such short notice, Dr. Rodriguez said, extending her hand. I know it's not ideal to start mid-semester, but we're really in a bind with Mrs. Patterson being out for medical leave. Rebecca shook her hand with a firm grip that surprised the principal slightly. I understand completely. I'm ready to step in wherever you need me. You'll be taking over her American history classes for the remainder of the school year. I have to be honest with you, some of these students can be quite challenging. Mrs. Patterson was. Well, let's just say she had some difficulties with classroom management before her leave. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. She had read between the lines in the job posting. Jefferson High was located in an economically struggling area where many students came from broken homes and behavioral issues were common. The school had a reputation for being tough on teachers, with a high turnover rate that had earned it the nickname the graveyard among local educators. I can handle difficult students, Rebecca said simply. I've worked with challenging populations before. Dr. Rodriguez looked relieved. On paper, Rebecca Thompson looked perfect for the job. She had a master's degree in history from Vanderbilt University, solid references from her previous positions, and most importantly, she was available immediately. What the principal didn't know was that Rebecca's previous positions had included serving as a captain in the United States Army, where she had led troops through 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan. Let me show you to your classroom, Doctor, Rodriguez said, leading her down a hallway lined with faded motivational posters and scuffed lockers. Your first class starts in about an hour. I'll introduce you to a few of the other teachers, and then you'll be on your own. As they walked, Rebecca observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had learned to assess threats and opportunities in hostile environments. She noted the locations of exits, the sight lines down the corridors, and the general atmosphere of controlled chaos that pervaded the school. Groups of students clustered around lockers, their voices carrying the particular energy of teenagers testing boundaries. The classroom was typical of an underfunded public school, 30 desks arranged in rows, a whiteboard that had seen better days, and windows that looked out onto a parking lot where several cars were missing hubcaps. Rebecca set her bag down on the desk and began to mentally organize her approach. Now, I should probably warn you about a few students, Dr. Rodriguez said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. There's a group of senior boys who have been particularly difficult this year. Tyler Bennett, Chase Morrison, and Dylan Cruz. They've been together since middle school, and they have a way of making things very unpleasant for teachers they don't respect. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but internally she was processing this information the way she once processed intelligence briefings. What kind of behavior should I expect? They're smart enough to stay just this side of serious disciplinary action, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Disrupting class, challenging authority, making inappropriate comments. They seem to take pleasure in seeing how far they can push before someone breaks. Mrs. Patterson filed several complaints, but they always claimed it was just joking around. I understand. Are there any specific incidents I should know about? Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. There was an incident last month where they somehow got hold of Mrs. Patterson's personal phone number and sent her some very inappropriate messages. We couldn't prove it was them, but the timing was suspicious. She was very shaken by it. Rebecca filed this information away. In the Army, she had dealt with all kinds of personalities, from scared 18-year-old recruits to seasoned soldiers, who tested every new officer's resolve. She had learned that respect was earned through competence and consistency, not through intimidation or pleading. I appreciate the warning, Rebecca said. I'll handle it. Something in her tone made Dr. Rodriguez look at her more carefully. There was a calmness in Rebecca's demeanor that suggested she had faced much worse challenges than difficult teenagers. The principal felt a flicker of hope that maybe this time they had found someone who could handle Jefferson High's most problematic students. After Dr. Rodriguez left, Rebecca spent the remaining time before class organizing her materials and reviewing the lesson plans Mrs. Patterson had left behind. The previous teacher's notes were peppered with frustrated comments about student behavior, highlighted sections about particular troublemakers, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain order. Rebecca's approach would be different. In the military, she had learned that the best way to handle potential problems was to establish clear expectations from the beginning and then consistently enforce them. She had commanded respect from soldiers who were bigger, stronger, and more experienced than her by demonstrating competence, fairness, and an unshakable resolve. The first bell rang, and students began filing into the classroom. Rebecca positioned herself behind her desk, observing each student as they entered. Most seemed like typical teenagers, some eager, some bored, some clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But 3 students immediately caught her attention. Tyler Bennett entered first, and everything about him screamed trouble. He was tall and lanky with bleached hair, styled in a carefully messy way that probably took significant effort to achieve. His clothes were expensive designer jeans and a brand-name hoodie that cost more than most teachers made in a week. He carried himself with the entitled swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Chase Morrison followed close behind, shorter and stockier than Tyler, but with the same arrogant energy. His dark hair was slicked back, and he wore a smirk that suggested he found the entire world amusing. He had the kind of face that parents instinctively distrusted, handsome enough to charm when he wanted to, but with eyes that hinted at cruelty. Dylan Cruz brought up the rear, and Rebecca immediately identified him as the follower of the group. He was nervous energy personified, constantly looking to Tyler and Chase for cues about how to behave. His clothing was an obvious attempt to copy his friend's style, but it didn't quite work on his smaller frame. The 3 boys made a show of taking seats in the back corner of the room, talking loudly and laughing at private jokes. Other students gave them a wide berth, clearly familiar with their reputation. Rebecca watched this display with the same detached interest she had once reserved for studying enemy movement patterns. "Good morning, class," Rebecca said once the bell rang. Her voice carried clearly through the room without being raised. "I'm Ms. Thompson, and I'll be your teacher for the remainder of the semester. What happened to Mrs. Patterson?" Tyler called out without raising his hand. "Did she finally have a nervous breakdown?" A few students laughed nervously, but most looked uncomfortable. Rebecca noted that Tyler was testing her immediately, trying to establish dominance through disruption. It was a classic power play that she had seen countless times in military settings. "Mrs. Patterson is on medical leave," Rebecca replied calmly. "If you have questions about the class, I'm happy to answer them after you raise your hand." Tyler's smirk widened. "Oh, we're going to be formal about everything? That's cute." Rebecca didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she simply began taking attendance, her voice remaining steady and professional. When she called Tyler's name, he responded with an exaggerated "present." That drew more nervous laughter from the class. "Today we're going to discuss the American Revolution," Rebecca said, turning to write on the whiteboard. "Specifically, we'll examine how superior strategy and discipline allowed a smaller, less equipped force to defeat a much larger army." "Sounds boring," Chase muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Rebecca continued writing, apparently unbothered by the comment. The British Army was one of the most powerful military forces in the world at that time. They had better weapons, more soldiers, and superior resources. But they underestimated their opponents and failed to adapt their tactics to a new kind of warfare. She turned back to face the class, her eyes briefly meeting those of each troublemaker. "Sometimes the biggest mistakes come from assuming you know everything about your enemy." Tyler leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he saw as a battle of wills. "So what you're saying is that anyone can beat anyone if they're sneaky enough?" "I'm saying that underestimating your opponent is always a mistake," Rebecca replied. "The British learned that lesson the hard way." The rest of the class passed relatively quietly, with Tyler, Chase, and Dylan limiting themselves to whispered comments and eye rolls. Rebecca delivered her lesson with the same calm professionalism she had shown in military briefings, never allowing the disruptions to derail her presentation. As students filed out after the bell, Tyler lingered behind with his friends. "Hey, Ms. Thompson," he called out, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "I just wanted to say welcome to Jefferson High. I hope you last longer than the last few teachers." "Thank you, Tyler," Rebecca replied, not looking up from her desk. "I plan to." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It's just that this place can be pretty tough on teachers who don't fit in," Chase added, stepping closer to her desk. "Students here don't respond well to authority figures who try to act all military and strict." Rebecca finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting Chase's with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. "I appreciate the advice," Dylan giggled nervously. "Yeah, Mrs. Patterson thought she was hot stuff too, and look how that turned out." "Have a good day, gentlemen," Rebecca said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. After they left, Rebecca sat quietly for a moment, processing what had just happened. These boys were clearly used to intimidating teachers, probably through a combination of psychological pressure and administrative manipulation. They had likely driven Mrs. Patterson to her breaking point through a carefully orchestrated campaign of harassment. In the Army, Rebecca had dealt with soldiers who tested new officers in similar ways. The key was to remain calm, consistent, and never let them see that their tactics were having any effect. She had learned that bullies, whether they were 17-year-old high school students or 25-year-old infantry soldiers, operated on the same basic principles. They targeted perceived weakness and backed down when faced with genuine strength. The rest of the day followed a similar pattern. In each class, Tyler, Chase, and Dylan would test boundaries in small ways, talking during instruction, making snide comments, or finding creative ways to disrupt without crossing lines that would result in immediate disciplinary action. Rebecca handled each incident with the same calm professionalism, never raising her voice or showing frustration. By the end of the day, word had spread through the school about the new teacher. Students whispered in hallways about how Ms. Thompson seemed different from the others, how she hadn't broken down or gotten flustered when the notorious trio tried their usual tricks. Some teachers looked at her with curiosity, wondering how long she would last before the stress got to her. Rebecca packed up her materials with the same methodical precision she had once used to clean her service weapon. She understood that today had been just the opening skirmish in what would likely be a longer conflict. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had been testing her defenses, looking for weak points they could exploit in future encounters. As she walked to her car, Rebecca reflected on the irony of her situation. She had left the military hoping to find a quieter, more peaceful career path. She had deliberately chosen substitute teaching because she thought it would be less stressful than maintaining a full-time position. Instead, she found herself facing a different kind of warfare, one where the enemy was closer to home and the stakes were the education and future of young people. But Rebecca Thompson had not survived 2 combat deployments by backing down from difficult situations. She had earned her rank through competence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those under her command. Now, her mission was different, but no less important: to create a safe learning environment where all students could see as she drove home to her small apartment, Rebecca began planning her strategy for the days ahead. She knew that Tyler, Chase, and Dylan would escalate their behavior, probably starting with subtle psychological pressure and building toward more aggressive tactics. They would likely try to isolate her from other faculty members, undermine her authority with students, and possibly attempt to humiliate her in front of the class. What they didn't know was that Rebecca had faced much worse enemies than 3 entitled teenagers. She had kept her cool under mortar fire, made life-and-death decisions in split seconds, and earned the respect of soldiers who had initially doubted her capabilities. She had learned to read people's intentions, anticipate their moves, and respond with exactly the right amount of force to neutralize threats without escalating situations unnecessarily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Rebecca Thompson was ready for whatever Tyler Bennett and his friends thought they could dish out. She had protected her country on foreign battlefields, and now she would protect her classroom from domestic bullies. The war for Jefferson High School was about to begin, and these boys had no idea what kind of opponent they were really facing. Second week at Jefferson High brought the first real test of Rebecca's resolve. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had spent the weekend strategizing, and they returned to school with a more coordinated approach to undermining her authority. It started subtly on Monday morning. Rebecca arrived early to prepare her lessons, but when she unlocked her classroom door, she found her whiteboard covered in crude drawings and inappropriate messages written in red marker. The words were juvenile but clearly designed to rattle her sexual innuendos mixed with personal attacks questioning her qualifications and appearance. Rebecca studied the vandalism with the same analytical mindset she had once applied to examining enemy positions. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, but the word choices and phrasing patterns suggested multiple authors. More importantly, whoever had done this had somehow gained access to her locked classroom, which meant they either had help from someone with keys or had developed sophisticated lock-picking skills. She photographed the board with her phone, then calmly erased everything and began writing her lesson plan. When maintenance arrived 20 minutes later in response to her call, she simply reported that vandalism had occurred overnight and requested that the locks be changed. "This happen often?" asked Jim Rodriguez, the head custodian and Dr. Rodriguez's younger brother. "First time for me," Rebecca replied. "But I imagine it won't be the last." Jim studied her carefully. Most teachers would have been upset, demanding investigations and threatening consequences. Rebecca's matter-of-fact response intrigued him. "You want me to put in a security request? Maybe get some cameras installed. That would be helpful, but don't go to any special trouble. I can handle whatever comes my way." When the first period began, Tyler, Chase, and Dylan filed in with barely contained grins. They had clearly expected to find Rebecca flustered and angry, perhaps even crying. Instead, she greeted the class with the same calm professionalism she had shown all week. "Today we're discussing the Boston Tea Party," Rebecca announced, turning to the clean whiteboard. An organized act of civil disobedience that sent a clear message to those in power. Tyler raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Ms. Thompson, I heard there was some trouble with your classroom this morning. Vandalism or something?" That must have been really upsetting. Rebecca turned to face him, her expression unchanged. "Thank you for your concern. Tyler, sometimes people resort to anonymous actions when they lack the courage to address issues directly. I just think it's terrible when people don't show proper respect," Chase chimed in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Like, who would do something so immature?" "Someone who doesn't understand the consequences of their actions," Rebecca replied smoothly. "The same kind of thinking that led the British to believe they could tax the colonies without representation." Dylan giggled nervously. "So what you're saying is that sometimes vandalism is like, historically justified?" Rebecca's eyes fixed on him with laser precision. "I'm saying that people who destroy other people's property usually discover that actions have consequences they didn't anticipate." The exchange set the tone for what became a daily escalation of psychological warfare. Over the following days, the three boys developed increasingly creative ways to test Rebecca's limits while maintaining plausible deniability. They began arriving at class exactly on time but making loud, disruptive entrances that interrupted her teaching. Tyler would dramatically burst through the door, claiming he had to run from another class. Chase would knock over his chair accidentally and spend several minutes apologizing while noisily rearranging his desk. Dylan would drop his books in a cascading crash that echoed through the room. Rebecca adapted by simply pausing her instruction until the disruption ended, then continuing exactly where she had left off. She never acknowledged the interruptions or showed any sign of irritation, which seemed to frustrate the boys more than shouting would have. They tried disrupting her lessons with fake medical emergencies. Chase claimed to have severe stomach pain and requested to visit the nurse, complete with dramatic groaning and clutching of his midsection. When Rebecca calmly directed him to the office, he suddenly felt better. Tyler developed mysterious headaches that required him to put his head down on his desk, but only during important parts of lectures. Rebecca responded by continuing to teach around them, occasionally asking other students to summarize points for their unwell classmates. When the fake sick students inevitably recovered, she would simply say, "I'm glad you're feeling better," and move on. The boys escalated to more personal attacks. They began making comments about her appearance, always phrased as compliments that carried insulting undertones. "Ms. Thompson, that's a really interesting outfit choice," Tyler would say about her. "Professional but modest clothing. Very practical. I like how you don't worry about trying to look younger like some teachers," Chase would add. "It's brave to just embrace the whole stern librarian look." Dylan would contribute nervous giggles and comments like, "Yeah, some teachers try too hard to be cool, but you're just totally comfortable being, serious all the time." Rebecca received these attacks with the same emotional detachment she had once maintained during hostile interrogations. She had been trained to recognize psychological manipulation techniques, and these amateur attempts were laughably transparent compared to what she had experienced in military intelligence work. The campaign expanded beyond the classroom. Rebecca began receiving anonymous text messages on her personal phone, despite having given that number only to the school administration. The messages started as seemingly helpful tips about dealing with difficult students, but quickly became more sinister. "Jefferson High can be tough on teachers who don't fit in," read one message. "Maybe you should consider finding a school that's more your speed. Some students here don't respond well to teachers who think they're better than everyone else." Said another, "It would be unfortunate if your reputation got damaged." "Mrs. Patterson thought she was tough too," warned a third. "We all know how that ended." Rebecca saved each message and forwarded them to her personal email account, building a digital paper trail. In the Army, she had learned the importance of documentation when dealing with harassment. Evidence was crucial for any eventual formal response. The harassment extended to her car. Rebecca arrived one morning to find her windshield covered in azavazin, petroleum jelly, making it impossible to drive safely. Another day, someone had let the air out of all 4 tires. Each incident was carefully calculated to cause maximum inconvenience without constituting serious property damage. Rebecca handled each attack with military efficiency. She kept windshield cleaner and paper towels in her trunk after the first incident. She purchased a portable air compressor after the tire incident. She began varying her parking spots and arrival times, making it harder for her tormentors to predict her movements. The psychological pressure campaign reached its peak during a parent-teacher conference week in late October. Rebecca had scheduled meetings with parents to discuss student progress, but several appointments were mysteriously canceled at the last minute. When she called to reschedule, she discovered that many parents had received anonymous phone calls claiming she had canceled the meetings herself. "I'm sorry for the confusion," explained Mrs. Davidson, mother of one of Rebecca's better students. "Someone called yesterday and said you had a family emergency and needed to reschedule all your appointments. They said you'd call us directly to set up new times." Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure that anyone at Jefferson High had witnessed. Interfering with parent communication crossed a line from personal harassment into educational sabotage. These boys weren't just attacking her anymore. They were actively undermining her ability to do her job effectively. "Mrs. Davidson," Rebecca said carefully, "I want to assure you that I never canceled our appointment. Someone has been making unauthorized calls using my name. Would you be willing to document this incident in writing?" The parent readily agreed, and Rebecca spent the evening calling other affected families to explain the situation. Most were understanding, but she could hear doubt creeping into some voices. Professional reputation was fragile in education, and even unfounded rumors could have lasting consequences. That evening, Rebecca sat in her apartment, analyzing the situation like a military strategist studying an enemy campaign. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had escalated from simple classroom disruption to systematic harassment designed to drive her from her position. They were using classic intimidation tactics: personal attacks, property damage, reputation destruction, and isolation from support systems. The boys were clearly more organized and sophisticated than typical teenage bullies. Their methods suggested either coaching from someone with experience in psychological warfare or an intuitive understanding of pressure points that was genuinely concerning. They had identified her phone number, gained access to parent contact information, and coordinated their attacks with military-like precision. Rebecca opened her laptop and began documenting everything she had observed. In the Army, intelligence gathering was crucial for mission success, and she approached this challenge with the same methodical thoroughness. She created a detailed timeline of incidents, analyzed patterns in their behavior, and identified potential weaknesses in their strategy. Tyler appeared to be the strategic leader, the one who planned their operations and coordinated timing. Was intelligent, charismatic, and skilled at manipulating both peers and adults. His weakness was his ego. He needed to be seen as the dominant figure and became frustrated when his authority was challenged. Chase was the tactical specialist, the one who executed plans and handled logistics. He was cruel by nature and seemed to genuinely enjoy causing distress to others. His weakness was his temper. When things didn't go according to plan, he became reckless and made mistakes. Dylan was the support player, providing nervous energy and comic relief while helping with simpler tasks. He was the most vulnerable member of the group, clearly uncomfortable with the more serious aspects of their campaign, but too dependent on group acceptance to withdraw. His weakness was his conscience. He occasionally showed signs of guilt and moral conflict. Rebecca also identified their tactical advantages. They had administrative protection through parents with influence in the community. Tyler's father was a successful lawyer. Chase's mother served on the school board, and Dylan's family owned several local businesses. This network provided them with advance warning of potential consequences and helped minimize punishments when they were caught. They also had institutional knowledge that came from years of operating within the Jefferson High system. They knew which teachers were allies, which administrators could be manipulated, and which rules could be bent without serious consequences. They understood the rhythm of the school year, the pressure points of standardized testing, and the administrative reluctance to create controversy. But Rebecca also identified significant weaknesses in their approach. Their campaign relied heavily on psychological intimidation, which was useless against someone with her mental conditioning. They assumed she would react emotionally to their provocations, giving them ammunition for further attacks. When she failed to break down, they were forced to escalate in ways that left them increasingly exposed. Most importantly, they underestimated her capabilities and background. They saw a quiet substitute teacher who seemed like an easy target, not a combat veteran with advanced training in psychological operations, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning. Rebecca closed her laptop and walked to her bedroom closet. Behind her teaching clothes hung a dress uniform she hadn't worn since her retirement ceremony. She touched the fabric gently, remembering the weight of command responsibility and the satisfaction of protecting those under her care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Rebecca Thompson was no longer just defending herself. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had made the mistake of attacking not just her personally, but the educational environment she was responsible for protecting. In the Army, she had sworn an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. These boys had just become domestic enemies of education itself, and Rebecca was about to remind them why underestimating a soldier was always a fatal error in judgment. The opening phase of their psychological campaign was ending, and phase 2 was about to begin on her terms, with her rules, and with consequences they couldn't possibly imagine. The war for Jefferson High School was about to enter a new phase, and Rebecca Thompson was finally ready to take the offensive. November brought an unseasonably cold snap to Millbrook, and with it, Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's most ambitious attempt yet to break Rebecca's resolve. They had grown frustrated with her unshakable composure and decided it was time to escalate their campaign to a level that would force her to react emotionally, or better yet, drive her to quit entirely. The plan began during a faculty meeting on the first Tuesday of the month. Rebecca was presenting her progress report on student achievement when Tyler's mother, Margaret Bennett, arrived unexpectedly. Margaret was a formidable woman in her mid-40s who served on multiple community boards and wielded considerable influence in local politics. She swept into the meeting room with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "I apologize for interrupting," Margaret announced, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But I've received some very disturbing reports about Ms. Thompson's teaching methods, and I felt this needed to be addressed immediately, Dr." Rodriguez looked surprised and uncomfortable. "Mrs. Bennett, this really isn't the appropriate venue for individual concerns. Perhaps we could schedule a private meeting to discuss. I think the entire faculty should hear this," Margaret interrupted, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "I've been contacted by several parents who are concerned about Ms. Thompson's hostile attitude toward students and her apparent inability to maintain classroom discipline." Rebecca remained seated, her expression neutral, but internally she was analyzing this new development. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Margaret Bennett had clearly been briefed by her son and was now launching a coordinated attack on Rebecca's professional reputation. "I have documented incidents of Ms. Thompson singling out certain students for harassment," Margaret continued, reading from prepared notes. "She's created a hostile learning environment where students feel intimidated and afraid to participate in class discussions." Other faculty members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several glanced at Rebecca, waiting to see how she would respond to these serious accusations. Rebecca had earned respect among her colleagues for her competence and professionalism. But public accusations from influential parents were dangerous in the education world. "Mrs. Bennett," Rebecca said calmly, "I'd be interested to hear specific examples of these alleged incidents. Documentation would be helpful for addressing any legitimate concerns." Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation. She had clearly expected Rebecca to become defensive or emotional, not to request evidence with the cool professionalism of someone conducting a formal inquiry. "Are you questioning the honesty of concerned parents?" Margaret demanded. "These are respected members of our community who have entrusted their children to this school's care. I'm asking for specifics so I can address any problems that may exist," Rebecca replied evenly. "If students feel uncomfortable in my classroom, I want to understand why and take appropriate corrective action." Dr. Rodriguez seized the opportunity to regain control of the meeting. "Mrs. Bennett, I appreciate your concerns, and I assure you we'll investigate any specific allegations. However, this faculty meeting isn't the appropriate forum for personnel discussions. Let's schedule a private meeting where we can review documentation and—" "There's more," Margaret interrupted, her voice rising. "I've also received reports that Ms. Thompson has been making inappropriate contact with families, calling parents at home and making veiled threats about their children's academic futures." This accusation was more serious, and Rebecca felt a flash of anger that she carefully suppressed. Margaret was essentially accusing her of professional misconduct allegations that could end her teaching career if they gained traction. "That's a very serious accusation," Rebecca said, her voice remaining steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I'd like to see documentation of these alleged inappropriate contacts, including phone records and witness statements." Margaret faltered slightly. She had expected Rebecca to panic or become angry, not to respond like a prosecutor building a case. "Well, The parents prefer to remain anonymous due to fear of retaliation. Anonymous accusations of professional misconduct are difficult to address constructively," Rebecca observed. "Without specific details, it's impossible to determine whether there's been a misunderstanding or if someone has been impersonating me." The mention of impersonation struck home. Several faculty members nodded knowingly. They were all aware of the mysterious phone calls that had disrupted Rebecca's parent conferences. Margaret's confident demeanor wavered as she realized her attack wasn't proceeding as planned. Dr. Rodriguez stood up, clearly eager to end this confrontation. "Mrs. Bennett, I think we've heard enough for now. Let's schedule a formal meeting where you can present your documentation and we can address these concerns properly. This faculty meeting needs to continue with our scheduled agenda." Margaret gathered her papers with obvious frustration. She had expected to humiliate Rebecca publicly and force the administration to take immediate action. Instead, Rebecca's calm professionalism had made Margaret look like an unreasonable parent making unfounded accusations. "This isn't over," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "The parents of this community won't tolerate teachers who abuse their authority." After she left, the room remained silent for several uncomfortable moments. Rebecca could feel her colleagues' eyes on her, assessing her reaction to this public attack. She understood that how she handled this moment would determine whether she retained their support or became isolated within the faculty. "I want to assure everyone that I take these allegations seriously," Rebecca said, addressing the room. "If any of you have observed problems with my teaching methods or student interactions, I'm open to feedback and willing to make improvements." Several teachers nodded appreciatively. Rebecca's response demonstrated exactly the kind of professionalism they hoped to see when facing unfair criticism. She wasn't denying the possibility of problems, but she was also standing up for herself with dignity. The meeting continued, but Rebecca's mind was working furiously. Margaret Bennett's attack had been too coordinated and well-timed to be spontaneous. Tyler had clearly manipulated his mother into launching this assault on Rebecca's reputation. probably by feeding her carefully edited information designed to make Rebecca look incompetent and abusive. After the meeting, several colleagues approached Rebecca privately to offer support. Janet Williams, a veteran English teacher, was particularly direct in her assessment. "That was a hit job," Janet said quietly. "Margaret Bennett has been gunning for teachers her precious Tyler doesn't like for years. She got Mrs. Patterson removed from the honors program last year with similar tactics." "What happened to Mrs. Patterson?" Rebecca asked. "Tyler didn't like his grade in her class, so Margaret launched a campaign claiming Patterson was biased against student athletes. Made her life so miserable that she transferred to middle school just to get away from the drama." Rebecca filed this information away. Understanding the pattern of previous attacks would help her anticipate Margaret and Tyler's next moves. They had successfully removed teachers before, which meant they would be confident in their ability to remove her as well. The real escalation began the following week during Rebecca's fourth period American history class. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had spent days planning what they considered their masterpiece, a coordinated attack designed to humiliate Rebecca so thoroughly that she would either quit in shame or lose her professional composure so completely that she could be dismissed for inappropriate behavior. The setup was elaborate. Dylan had volunteered to give a presentation on the Civil War, ostensibly as a way to improve his failing grade. Rebecca had agreed, seeing it as an opportunity for a struggling student to demonstrate understanding of the material. What she didn't know was that Dylan's presentation was designed as a trap. The boys had prepared a slideshow that began legitimately, but gradually incorporated increasingly inappropriate content designed to embarrass and demoralize her. Dylan began normally, discussing the causes of the Civil War with apparent sincerity. Rebecca listened approvingly as he covered economic differences between North and South, the role of slavery, and the breakdown of political compromise. For the first 10 minutes, it seemed like a genuine effort to improve his academic performance. Then the content began to shift subtly. Dylan started incorporating personal commentary that seemed designed to draw parallels between historical conflicts and modern classroom dynamics. He discussed how authoritarian leadership styles often led to rebellion, how outside agitators disrupted established social systems, and how occupying forces were eventually rejected by local populations. Rebecca recognized the coded language immediately. Dylan was essentially comparing her to an invading army that would eventually be defeated by local resistance. It was more sophisticated than typical teenage rebellion, suggesting adult coaching or significant research into psychological warfare techniques. The presentation reached its crescendo when Dylan clicked to a slide that appeared to show a Civil War battle scene but was actually a carefully doctored image that included Rebecca's face superimposed onto the body of a soldier being defeated by Confederate forces. The image was accompanied by text reading, "When outsiders try to impose their will on established communities, they usually discover that local knowledge trumps foreign interference." The classroom erupted in shocked laughter and gasps. Some students were genuinely appalled by the obvious attack on their teacher, while others seemed thrilled by the unprecedented audacity of the display. Tyler and Chase were grinning openly, barely containing their excitement at finally provoking a reaction. Rebecca stared at the screen for a long moment, processing what had just happened. This went far beyond typical classroom disruption or even personal harassment. The boys had created what amounted to propaganda designed to dehumanize her and undermine her authority in the most public way possible. For the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, Rebecca felt her military training kicking in at a visceral level. She had been insulted, attacked, and professionally sabotaged by enemy combatants who were using psychological warfare techniques against her. Every instinct developed through years of combat experience was screaming at her to respond with overwhelming force, but she was also acutely aware that this was exactly what they wanted. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had spent weeks trying to provoke an emotional reaction that would give them ammunition for further attacks. If she lost her composure now, Margaret Bennett would have all the evidence she needed to have. Rebecca dismissed for unprofessional conduct. Rebecca walked slowly to the front of the classroom, her movements deliberate and controlled. The room fell silent as students waited to see how she would respond to this unprecedented attack. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared excited by the drama, and a few seemed genuinely concerned about what might happen next. "Dylan," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several students sit up straighter. "That was certainly an interesting interpretation of Civil War history." Dylan's confident grin faltered slightly. He had expected shouting, tears, or at least visible anger. Rebecca's calm response was somehow more unsettling than any emotional outburst would have been. "Turn off the projector and take your seat," Rebecca continued. "We need to discuss the difference between historical analysis and personal opinion." "But I'm not finished with my presentation," Dylan protested, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Yes, you are," Rebecca replied, and something in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a request. Dylan fumbled with the equipment, his hands shaking slightly as he shut down the projector. The classroom remained silent as he returned to his seat, suddenly aware that the dynamic had shifted in ways he didn't fully understand. Rebecca turned to face the class, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that none of them had heard before. "Throughout American history, people have used propaganda and personal attacks when they lacked the intellectual capability to engage in honest debate. It's a sign of weakness, not strength, when someone resorts to character assassination instead of addressing issues directly." She paused, letting her words sink in. The Confederacy used similar tactics, creating propaganda that dehumanized their opponents because they couldn't win through legitimate political discourse. It's a strategy that reveals more about the character of those who use it than about their intended targets. Tyler's smirk was completely gone now. He was beginning to realize that their carefully planned attack had not only failed to break Rebecca's composure, but had actually given her an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of strength and professionalism that earned genuine respect. "For tomorrow," Rebecca continued, "I want everyone to research a historical example of propaganda and analyze how it was used to manipulate public opinion. We'll discuss how societies protect themselves against these techniques and why critical thinking is essential for democratic citizenship." The bell rang, and students filed out in unusual silence. The dramatic confrontation they had expected had turned into a lesson about intellectual integrity and historical analysis. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan lingered behind, clearly unsure how to process what had just happened. "Miss Thompson," Tyler said, attempting to regain some of his lost bravado, "I hope you don't think that presentation was anything personal." Dylan was just trying to be creative with his assignment. Rebecca looked at him with the same steady gaze she had once reserved for hostile interrogation subjects. "Tyler, I've been analyzing propaganda and psychological warfare techniques since before you were born. I recognize professional-level manipulation when I see it." The casual mention of psychological warfare expertise sent a chill through all three boys. For the first time, they were beginning to suspect that their quiet substitute teacher might not be quite what she appeared to be. "Have a good afternoon, gentlemen," Rebecca said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. As they left, Tyler, Chase, and Dylan were unusually quiet. Their most ambitious attack had not only failed, but had somehow made Rebecca seem more formidable than before. They were beginning to realize that they might have seriously underestimated their opponent. Rebecca stood alone in her classroom, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had just occurred. These boys had crossed every line of appropriate behavior, attacking her professionally, personally, and now publicly in front of other students. They had escalated their campaign to a level that demanded a proportional response. For months, Rebecca had been playing defense, absorbing their attacks while maintaining her professional composure. But Dylan's presentation had changed the nature of the conflict. This was no longer about teenage rebellion or testing boundaries. This was warfare. And her opponents had just made the strategic error of revealing their true capabilities and intentions. Rebecca Thompson had spent years learning how to fight enemies who threatened innocent people. Now Tyler Bennett, Chase Morrison, and Delanne Cruz had officially declared themselves enemies of her classroom, her students, and her mission to provide quality education. The defensive phase of this conflict was over. Tomorrow, Rebecca would begin teaching these boys about the difference between playing at warfare and facing a real soldier. They were about to discover why underestimating a combat veteran was always a fatal tactical error. Rebecca Thompson spent that evening in her apartment, like a general preparing for a decisive battle. The humiliating presentation had been the final provocation, and she was no longer content to merely defend herself. It was time to gather intelligence, understand her enemy's weaknesses, and prepare a counteroffensive that would end this conflict permanently. She opened her laptop and began what she called target assessment, a systematic analysis of Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's vulnerabilities that went far beyond their classroom behavior. In Afghanistan, successful operations required understanding not just enemy tactics, but their personal motivations, family dynamics, and pressure points that could be exploited when necessary. Rebecca started with social media reconnaissance. Tyler Bennett's Instagram account was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. The boy documented his life with the entitled carelessness of someone who had never faced real consequences. Photos showed him at parties with underage drinking, posts bragged about academic cheating, and videos captured him making racist and sexist comments that would horrify school administrators. Most damaging was a series of posts from the previous month where Tyler had filmed himself and his friends vandalizing school property. The videos were meant to be humorous, showing them spray painting inappropriate messages on bathroom walls and damaging equipment in empty classrooms. Tyler had been careless with privacy settings, and the posts were visible to anyone who knew where to look. Chase Morrison's digital footprint revealed different but equally exploitable information. His online gaming profile showed a pattern of harassment toward female players that included explicit sexual threats and racist slurs. More importantly, his accounts were linked to several forums where he had purchased and distributed academic assignments for money, a sophisticated cheating operation that violated multiple school policies. Dylan Cruz's vulnerabilities were more psychological than legal. His social media revealed deep insecurities about his friendship with Tyler and Chase, constant anxiety about fitting in, and a genuine conflict between his conscience and his need for acceptance. His posts often showed guilt about their harassment campaigns, usually disguised as dark humor but clearly expressing moral discomfort. Rebecca also discovered something interesting about Dylan's family situation. His parents were going through a bitter divorce, and Dylan was caught between two households with very different expectations. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse to support the family, while his father had moved to Atlanta with a younger girlfriend. Dylan's acting out appeared to be a desperate attempt to maintain some sense of control in a chaotic personal life. The intelligence gathering extended beyond social media. Rebecca used her security clearance contacts to run background checks on all three families. What she discovered added crucial context to the boys' behavior patterns and gave her additional leverage if the situation required escalation. Tyler's father, Richard Bennett, was indeed a successful lawyer, but his practice was under investigation by the State Bar Association for ethics violations related to client trust fund management. The family's affluent lifestyle was increasingly supported by credit and loans rather than actual income. Tyler's expensive clothes and gadgets were purchased by parents desperate to maintain appearances. While facing potential financial ruin, Chase's mother, Linda Morrison, had used her school board position to secure favorable treatment for her son throughout his academic career. Rebecca found documentation of grade changes, disciplinary record modifications, and preferential treatment that constituted clear conflicts of interest. More concerning was evidence that Linda had pressured other teachers to inflate Chase's grades in exchange for favorable committee assignments and budget approvals. Dylan's family situation was as complicated as his social media suggested. His parents' divorce proceedings included allegations of domestic violence, financial misconduct, and child neglect. Dylan was essentially raising himself while his parents battled over assets and custody arrangements. His association with Tyler and Chase provided the stability and attention he wasn't receiving at home. Armed with this intelligence, Rebecca began developing what military strategists called a pressure point analysis. She identified specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited to neutralize each target without resorting to direct confrontation. The key was applying precisely the right amount of leverage to achieve desired behavioral changes while maintaining plausible deniability. For Tyler, the primary vulnerability was his family's reputation and financial instability. His mother's public attack on Rebecca had been motivated by fear that Tyler's academic problems might jeopardize his college prospects and the family's social standing. If Tyler's true behavior became public knowledge, it would destroy the carefully maintained facade that his parents desperately needed to preserve. For Chase, the vulnerability was his mother's position on the school board. Linda Morrison's unethical conduct was exactly the kind of scandal that could end political careers and trigger criminal investigations. If evidence of her corruption became public, Chase would lose his protective shield and face consequences. For years of unpunished misconduct, for Dylan, the vulnerability was emotional rather than legal. He was clearly torn between loyalty to his friends and his own moral compass. The right approach could separate him from Tyler and Chase while providing him with the positive attention and guidance he was seeking through negative behavior. Rebecca's military training had taught her that the best operations achieved maximum results with minimal direct action. Rather than confronting her tormentors directly, she would create conditions that forced them to confront the consequences of their own actions. She would become the catalyst for their self-destruction rather than their destroyer. The operation began on Wednesday morning with a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to apply psychological pressure while maintaining complete plausibility. Rebecca had learned in intelligence work that the most effective operations were those where targets never realized they were under attack until it was too late. Rebecca's first move was administrative. She scheduled individual meetings with Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's parents to discuss their son's academic progress. This was completely routine and wouldn't raise suspicions, but it would force each family to examine their child's behavior under official scrutiny. She prepared detailed academic assessments that were scrupulously fair, but highlighted concerning patterns in each student's work. Tyler's assessment noted his tendency to submit assignments that showed evidence of outside assistance beyond what was academically appropriate. Chase's evaluation documented his pattern of disruptive behavior and its impact on other students' learning. Dylan's report emphasized his potential for academic success, while noting attendance and participation issues that suggested personal challenges. The meetings were scheduled for the following week, giving Rebecca time to implement the second phase of her operation. She contacted Jefferson High's technology department and requested a comprehensive audit of student computer usage, citing concerns about cyberbullying and inappropriate content sharing. This was a routine request that wouldn't target anyone specifically, but would inevitably uncover Tyler and Chase's digital misconduct. Rebecca also reached out to Dr. Rodriguez with a formal proposal for expanding the school's anti-bullying programs. She suggested implementing peer mediation training, anonymous reporting systems, and regular workshops on digital citizenship. Her military background in conflict resolution made her uniquely qualified to lead such initiatives, and the administration was eager to embrace proactive approaches to behavioral problems. The beauty of this strategy was that every action Rebecca took was not only completely legitimate, but actively beneficial to the school community. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was implementing systemic improvements that would naturally expose and correct the problematic behaviors she had been enduring. Phase 3 involved careful documentation and evidence preservation. Rebecca began recording all interactions with Tyler, Chase, and Dylan using a discrete voice recorder. Tennessee was a one-party consent state, making such recordings completely legal as long as she was present during the conversations. She also started maintaining detailed written logs of every incident, complete with dates, times, witnesses, and photographic evidence where appropriate. Most importantly, Rebecca began building alliances within the school community. She volunteered for additional duties, offered to help struggling students with tutoring, and made herself available for extra administrative tasks. Her goal was to establish herself as an indispensable member of the faculty, while gathering intelligence about the broader dynamics affecting student behavior. Through these activities, Rebecca discovered that Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's harassment wasn't limited to her classroom. Several other teachers had experienced similar problems, but had been reluctant to report incidents due to fear of administrative retaliation or parental pressure. Rebecca began quietly encouraging these colleagues to document future problems and assured them that she was developing strategies to address the underlying issues. She also identified students who had been victims of the Three Boys bullying campaigns. Many were afraid to speak up due to fear of escalation, but Rebecca's patient encouragement and obvious competence gradually earned their trust. She learned about academic sabotage, social media harassment, and physical intimidation that went far beyond what she had personally experienced. The most valuable intelligence came from Jennifer Walsh, a sophomore who had been targeted by Tyler and his friends the previous year. Jennifer had nearly transferred schools due to their harassment, but had stayed after her parents threatened legal action. She provided Rebecca with detailed accounts of the boys' methods, including their use of social media manipulation, academic sabotage, and coordinated family pressure to silence victims. "They're really smart about it," Jennifer explained during a private conversation after class. "They never leave obvious evidence, and they always make it look like the victim is overreacting or making things up. Tyler's mom is especially good at making parents think their kids are lying about what happened." Jennifer also revealed the existence of a group chat where Tyler, Chase, and Dylan coordinated their harassment campaigns and shared humiliating photos and information about their targets. The chat included several other students who participated in the bullying, either actively or by remaining silent about what they witnessed. This information was crucial because it established a pattern of systematic harassment that went far beyond individual incidents. Rebecca realized she wasn't dealing with typical teenage rebellion, but with an organized campaign of intimidation that had been operating for years with administrative knowledge but without effective intervention. Armed with this intelligence, Rebecca refined her operational plan. Rather than targeting Tyler, Chase, and Dylan individually, she would expose the entire network of harassment and corruption that enabled their behavior. This approach would prevent them from simply finding new victims, while ensuring that the systemic problems were addressed comprehensively. Rebecca's military experience had taught her that sustainable victories required changing the conditions that created conflicts, not just defeating immediate opponents. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan were symptoms of larger problems within Jefferson High's culture and administration. Removing them without addressing those underlying issues would simply allow similar problems to emerge with different participants. The final element of her intelligence operation involved understanding the administrative and political dynamics that had allowed this situation to develop. Rebecca discreetly researched the relationships between school board members, local politicians, and influential families like the Bennetts and Morrisons. She discovered a web of mutual obligations and shared interests that explained why previous complaints about student harassment had been ignored or minimized. Margaret Bennett's law firm handled legal work for several school board members. Linda Morrison's board position gave her influence over hiring decisions and budget allocations that affected faculty careers. Other influential families had similar relationships that created a protective network around their children's behavior. This network had successfully prevented accountability for years, but it also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood how such systems worked. Rebecca spent Friday evening reviewing her intelligence files and finalizing her operational timeline. She had identified every major vulnerability, established legal documentation procedures, and built the alliances necessary to ensure success. More importantly, she had positioned herself as a solution to problems the administration desperately needed to solve rather than as a troublemaker seeking personal revenge. The weekend would be her final preparation period. Starting Monday, Rebecca Thompson would begin the most important mission of her civilian career, dismantling a network of intimidation and corruption that had been poisoning Jefferson High School for years. Tyler, Chase, and Dylan thought they were playing games with a substitute teacher, but they were about to discover they had been engaging in psychological warfare with a combat veteran who understood exactly how to win battles they didn't even know they were fighting. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. Operation Jefferson was about to begin, and Rebecca's opponents had no idea what was coming for them. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect military operation. Rebecca Thompson walked into Jefferson High School carrying herself differently than she had for months. Gone was the deliberately invisible posture of someone trying to avoid conflict. In its place was the confident bearing of an officer preparing to execute a carefully planned mission. The first phase of Operation Jefferson began at exactly 7:45 a.m. when Rebecca submitted a formal written complaint to Dr. Rodriguez's office. The document was a masterpiece of military precision, 12 pages of meticulously documented incidents, complete with dates, times, witnesses, and photographic evidence. More importantly, it contextualized individual harassment incidents within a broader pattern of systematic intimidation that violated federal anti-bullying statutes. Rebecca had learned in the Army that successful operations began with controlling the narrative. Rather than presenting herself as a victim seeking help, she positioned herself as a professional educator, identifying institutional failures that required immediate administrative action. The complaint didn't just detail what Tyler, Chase, and Dylan had done to her. It exposed how their behavior was part of a larger problem that threatened the school's legal compliance and educational mission. Dr. Rodriguez, Rebecca said as she handed over the complaint, "I've documented a pattern of student harassment that appears to violate both school policy and federal regulations. I'm requesting a formal investigation and the implementation of corrective measures to ensure a safe learning environment for all students and staff." Dr. Rodriguez accepted the document with visible concern. The formal language and official presentation made it clear this wasn't a routine disciplinary complaint, but a serious allegation that could have legal ramifications for the school district. "Ms. Thompson, this is quite comprehensive. I'll need time to review." "Of course," Rebecca interrupted smoothly. "I've also copied the relevant portions to the district's compliance officer and requested guidance on federal reporting requirements. I want to ensure we're handling this situation appropriately." The mention of federal compliance and district oversight sent a clear message. This issue had escalated beyond internal school politics and would require official administrative response. Dr. Rodriguez could no longer handle Rebecca's situation quietly or allow it to be dismissed through informal pressure. Rebecca's second move occurred during first period, when she implemented what she called enhanced documentation protocols. She had equipped her classroom with a discrete recording system that captured both audio and video of all interactions. More importantly, she had positioned the system to record student conversations before and after class conversations where Tyler, Chase, and Dylan often revealed their true intentions and methods. The boys arrived for class with their usual swagger, unaware that their private discussions were now being documented with legal quality evidence. As they settled into their seats, Rebecca overheard Tyler briefing the others on his mother's latest strategy. "Mom says we need to be more careful about what we say in front of other teachers," Tyler whispered. "But Thompson's gonna be gone soon. Anyway, the school board meeting is Thursday, and Mom's got 3 other parents ready to demand her removal." Chase grinned maliciously. "My mom says she's got documentation proving Thompson's been making inappropriate contact with families. Between that and the parent complaints, she won't last another week." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, guys. She didn't react the way we expected to my presentation. Maybe we should just leave her alone and focus on. Are you going soft on us, Dylan?" Tyler's voice carried a threatening edge. "Because if you're not with us, you're against us. And you know what happens to people who work against us." Rebecca continued writing on the whiteboard as if she hadn't heard anything, but internally she was analyzing the intelligence gold mine she had just captured. The boys had revealed their coordination with parents, their intention to remove her through administrative pressure, and most importantly, Tyler's use of intimidation to maintain group loyalty. This conversation alone provided evidence of conspiracy and witness intimidation that could be used to dismantle their entire operation. The third phase began during lunch when Rebecca executed what military strategists called a preemptive strike. Instead of waiting for Margaret Bennett and Linda Morrison to present their case to the school board, Rebecca scheduled individual meetings with each board member to present her own evidence and recommendations. Her first meeting was with Board Chairman Robert Hayes, a retired businessman who prided himself on running efficient, professional meetings. Rebecca had researched his background and knew he valued data-driven decision-making and had little patience for personal drama. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for meeting with me on such short notice," Rebecca began, setting down a professionally bound report. "I've identified some serious compliance issues that I believe require board attention before they become legal liabilities for the district." Hayes accepted the report with interest. Rebecca's presentation was unlike anything he typically received from teachers. It was formatted like a corporate analysis with executive summaries, data tables, and specific recommendations for corrective action. "Ms. Thompson, this is quite thorough. These allegations about student harassment and parental interference are very serious." "Yes, sir. I've documented patterns of behavior that appear to violate both federal anti-bullying regulations and state education codes. More concerning is evidence suggesting that administrative responses to previous complaints may not have met legal standards for institutional protection." Rebecca had carefully researched the legal obligations that school districts faced regarding harassment complaints. Her report demonstrated that Jefferson High's previous handling of similar situations had created potential liability exposure that could result in federal investigations and costly litigation. "What specific actions are you recommending?" Hayes asked, clearly taking the situation seriously. "I'm proposing a comprehensive review of current anti-bullying policies, implementation of enhanced reporting systems, and mandatory training for both staff and parents on harassment prevention. I'm also recommending that the district consult with legal counsel to ensure our current practices meet federal compliance standards." Hayes nodded approvingly. Rebecca's recommendations were exactly the kind of proactive risk management that responsible school boards needed to implement. More importantly, her professional approach and obvious competence made her a credible source of institutional reform rather than a problem employee. Seeking personal vindication, that similar meetings with other board members followed throughout the week. Rebecca presented each member with carefully tailored information that highlighted different aspects of the institutional problems she had identified. Her strategy was to position herself as an expert consultant rather than a victim, someone who could help the board solve problems rather than create new ones. The fourth phase involved what Rebecca called controlled information release. Rather than waiting for Tyler, Chase, and Dylan to escalate their harassment campaign, she began strategically sharing evidence of their misconduct with parents, teachers, and students who had been affected by their behavior. Rebecca's first target was Jennifer Walsh's mother, Patricia, who had previously threatened legal action over her daughter's harassment. Rebecca contacted Patricia directly and shared evidence that Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's harassment of Jennifer had been part of a systematic campaign that was still ongoing. Mrs. Walsh, I wanted to make you aware that the students who targeted Jennifer last year are currently engaged in similar behavior toward other victims, Rebecca explained during their phone conversation. I have documented evidence that might be relevant to your previous concerns about your daughter's treatment. Patricia Walsh was immediately interested. She had suspected that Jennifer's harassment was more organized than school officials had acknowledged, but she had lacked the evidence needed to prove systematic misconduct. What kind of evidence are we talking about, Ms. Thompson? Social media posts, coordinated harassment campaigns, and documentation of administrative failures to address the pattern of behavior. I believe this information might support Jennifer's account of what happened and demonstrate that the school's response was inadequate. Rebecca shared carefully selected evidence that corroborated Jennifer's previous complaints while establishing the ongoing nature of the harassment network. Patricia Walsh immediately understood the implications. If this was systematic behavior that the school had failed to address, her daughter's case could be reopened with much stronger evidence. Ms. Thompson, I think my husband and I need to have another conversation with the school administration. Would you be willing to present this evidence at a formal meeting? Absolutely. I believe Jennifer and other students deserve a safe learning environment, and that requires addressing the underlying problems that allowed this behavior to continue. Similar conversations with other affected families followed. Rebecca contacted parents whose children had been harassed by Tyler, Chase, and Dylan over the past several years, providing them with evidence that their children's experiences were part of a documented pattern rather than isolated incidents. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents who had previously felt powerless to challenge influential families, like the Bennetts and Morrisons, suddenly realized they had allies and evidence. Within days, Dr. Rodriguez's office was flooded with formal complaints from families demanding action on harassment issues they had previously been afraid to report. Rebecca's fifth move was perhaps the most elegant. She volunteered to lead the district's new anti-bullying initiative. Her military background in conflict resolution and her documented experience with harassment intervention made her the obvious choice to spearhead institutional reforms. More importantly, this position gave her official authority to investigate the very problems she had been experiencing personally. Dr. Rodriguez, I'd like to volunteer to chair the district's anti-bullying task force, Rebecca announced during their scheduled meeting to discuss her formal complaint. My background in conflict resolution and my recent experiences at Jefferson High have given me unique insights into the institutional changes we need to implement. Dr. Rodriguez was clearly relieved. Rebecca's offer solved multiple problems simultaneously. It provided expert leadership for a critical initiative, while positioning the district as proactive in addressing harassment issues. Most importantly, it transformed Rebecca from a problem that needed to be managed into a solution that the administration desperately needed. That's an excellent idea, Ms. Thompson. Your expertise would be invaluable in developing new policies and training programs. I've already begun drafting recommendations. For board consideration, I believe we can implement comprehensive reforms that will not only address current problems but prevent similar issues in the future. Rebecca's appointment to lead the anti-bullying initiative was announced the same day that Margaret Bennett and Linda Morrison planned to present their case for her removal to the school board. Suddenly, their attack on a problematic teacher became an assault on the district's newly appointed harassment prevention expert. The optics were disastrous for their campaign. The sixth phase involved exposing the corruption that had enabled Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's behavior to continue unchecked. Rebecca had discovered that Linda Morrison's influence over grade changes and disciplinary decisions constituted clear conflicts of interest that violated both school board ethics and state education regulations. Rebecca prepared a detailed report documenting Linda Morrison's misuse of her position to protect her son from academic and disciplinary consequences. The evidence included email communications between Linda and school staff, records of grade changes that coincided with board committee assignments, and testimony from teachers who had been pressured to modify disciplinary reports rather than presenting this information directly. Rebecca shared it with investigative journalists who covered education issues for the local newspaper and television stations. Her military intelligence background had taught her that information often had more impact when it came from independent sources rather than interested parties. The media response was swift and devastating. School board member accused of corruption. Headlines dominated local news cycles, complete with documented evidence of ethical violations and conflicts of interest. Linda Morrison found herself defending her position on the school board, rather than attacking Rebecca's competence as a teacher. The seventh and final phase of Rebecca's counteroffensive was designed to separate Dylan from Tyler and Chase while providing him with positive alternatives to his current destructive behavior. Rebecca had identified Dylan as the most vulnerable member of the group and the most likely to respond to genuine guidance and support. Rebecca approached Dylan privately after class, speaking to him with the same direct honesty she had once used with soldiers under her command who were making poor choices. "Dylan, I know you're going through a difficult time with your family situation," Rebecca began. "I also know you're not comfortable with everything that's been happening in our class recently." Dylan's eyes widened with surprise and fear. He clearly hadn't expected to be confronted directly about his role in the harassment campaign. "I don't know what you mean, Ms. Thompson. Dylan, I was a military officer for 12 years. I know how to recognize when someone is following orders they don't believe in because they're afraid of being abandoned by their unit." The military analogy struck home immediately. Dylan's posture sagged as he realized that Rebecca understood his situation better than he had expected. "I want to offer you an alternative," Rebecca continued. "I'm starting a peer mediation program that will train students to help resolve conflicts and support classmates who are struggling. I think you have the empathy and intelligence to be excellent at this kind of work." Dylan looked up with genuine surprise. No adult at Jefferson High had ever suggested that he might be good at anything constructive. "You really think I could do something like that?" "I think you have exactly the kind of personal experience that would help you understand and assist other students who are dealing with difficult family situations or social pressures. The question is whether you're ready to use your experiences to help people instead of hurting them." Rebecca's offer provided Dylan with something he had been desperately seeking: genuine respect and a sense of purpose that didn't depend on Tyler and Chase's approval. For the first time in months, he had been offered a path toward positive recognition and meaningful contribution. "What would I have to do?" Dylan asked quietly. "First, you'd need to commit to ending any participation in harassment or intimidation of other students. Then you'd complete training in conflict resolution and peer counseling. After that, you'd work with me to help other students who are facing the kinds of challenges you've experienced." Dylan nodded slowly, clearly wrestling with the decision to break away from Tyler and Chase, But Rebecca's offer represented everything he actually wanted: adult respect, meaningful work, and a chance to make positive contributions rather than destructive ones. "Can I think about it over the weekend?" Dylan asked. "Of course, but Dylan understands that this offer has an expiration date. The choices you make in the next few days will determine whether you're part of the solution to these problems or whether you remain part of the problem." As Dylan left the classroom, Rebecca knew she had successfully executed every phase of her counteroffensive. Tyler and Chase's network of protection was crumbling. Their parents were facing public scandals, their methods had been exposed and documented, and their most vulnerable ally was considering defection. Operation Jefferson was proceeding exactly as planned. And Rebecca Thompson was about to demonstrate why military strategists always emphasize that the best victories were achieved before the enemy realized they were under attack. The school board meeting on Thursday evening was packed beyond capacity, with standing room only in Jefferson High's main auditorium. What had been planned as Margaret Bennett and Linda Morrison's coordinated assault on Rebecca Thompson had transformed into a public reckoning that would reshape the entire district's approach to student harassment and administrative accountability. Rebecca arrived 30 minutes early, dressed in her most professional attire, a navy blue suit that subtly evoked her military background without being overtly martial. She carried a leather portfolio containing meticulously organized evidence, witness statements, and legal documentation that represented months of strategic preparation. More importantly, she was accompanied by Patricia Walsh and 6 other parents, whose children had been victims of the harassment network she was about to expose. Margaret Bennett and Linda Morrison were already seated in the front row, flanked by their own supporters and clearly confident that their coordinated attack would succeed. They had spent weeks preparing their case against Rebecca, gathering what they believed was sufficient ammunition to force her removal. What they didn't realize was that their target had been preparing a comprehensive counterattack that would devastate their entire network of influence and protection. Board Chairman Robert Hayes called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock, his expression grave as he surveyed the unusually large audience. The agenda showed 2 major items: personnel concerns regarding substitute teacher Rebecca Thompson and a proposal for new anti-bullying initiatives. Neither Margaret nor Linda suspected that these 2 items were actually parts of a single, coordinated presentation that would expose their years of misconduct. "Before we begin tonight's formal agenda," Hayes announced, "I want to address some serious concerns that have been brought to the board's attention regarding harassment, intimidation, and potential violations of federal education regulations within our district." Margaret Bennett's confident expression faltered slightly. This wasn't the opening she had expected, and Hayes' formal tone suggested that the board was treating these issues with unusual seriousness. "Ms. Thompson," Hayes continued, "you've requested time to present information relevant to these concerns. The board is prepared to hear your presentation." Rebecca stood and walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who had briefed military commanders in combat zones. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned respect in life-and-death situations and was now applying that same competence to protect vulnerable students. "Chairman Hayes, board members, and community members," Rebecca began, "I'm here tonight to present evidence of systematic harassment, administrative corruption, and institutional failures that have created a hostile environment for students and staff at Jefferson High School." She activated the room's projection system and displayed her first slide, a timeline showing harassment incidents reported over the past 3 years, cross-referenced with administrative responses and ultimate outcomes. The pattern was immediately apparent. Complaints involving certain families were routinely dismissed or minimized, while other students faced severe consequences for much less serious infractions. This data demonstrates a clear pattern of selective enforcement that has allowed a network of student harassers to operate with virtual impunity, Rebecca continued. More concerning is evidence suggesting that administrative decisions have been influenced by personal relationships and political considerations rather than educational best practices. Margaret Bennett shot to her feet. "This is outrageous." Ms. Thompson was supposed to be answering complaints about her own conduct, not making wild accusations against Mrs. Bennett. Hayes interrupted firmly. "Ms. Thompson has the floor. You'll have an opportunity to respond when she's finished." Rebecca's second slide showed social media screenshots documenting Tyler, Chase, and Dylan's harassment campaigns against multiple students. The evidence was damning: coordinated attacks, celebration of victims' distress, and explicit planning of escalation strategies. More importantly, the timestamp showed that this harassment had continued even after formal complaints had been filed and supposedly addressed. These communications demonstrate that the perpetrators view their harassment as a game, with teachers and administrators as obstacles to be manipulated rather than authorities to be respected, Rebecca explained. They document specific strategies for avoiding consequences while maximizing psychological damage to their targets. The auditorium was completely silent as parents and community members absorbed the implications of what they were seeing. Many recognized their own children in the victim testimonials that Rebecca displayed, while others began to understand why certain students had struggled academically or socially despite apparent capability. Rebecca's third section focused on administrative failures and corruption. She presented email communications showing Linda Morrison's inappropriate interference in disciplinary decisions involving her son and his associates. The evidence included grade changes that coincided with favorable committee assignments, pressure on teachers to modify incident reports, and coordination with other influential parents to silence complaints. Board member Morrison has used her position to create a two-tiered system of accountability where certain students face no meaningful consequences for serious misconduct, Rebecca stated. This corruption has not only enabled continued harassment, but has sent a clear message to the entire school community that influence matters more than integrity. Linda Morrison's face had gone pale, and she was frantically whispering with her attorney. The evidence Rebecca was presenting was far more comprehensive and legally damaging than anything she had expected. Worse, the professional quality of the presentation made it clear that this wasn't an emotional outburst, but a carefully prepared legal case. Rebecca's fourth section presented the broader institutional impact of the harassment network. She showed declining academic performance in classes affected by harassment, increased absenteeism among targeted students, and a pattern of teacher turnover in positions that required confronting influential families. The data painted a picture of an educational environment that was systematically failing its most vulnerable students while protecting its most privileged ones. The cost of this institutional failure extends far beyond individual victims, Rebecca explained. It has created a culture where academic achievement and personal integrity are less valued than social status and family connections. This undermines the fundamental mission of public education and violates our obligation to provide equal educational opportunities for all students. For her final section, Rebecca presented her recommendations for comprehensive reform. Unlike typical complaint presentations that focused on punishment for wrongdoers, Rebecca's proposals were forward-looking and constructive. She outlined specific policy changes, training programs, and accountability measures that would prevent similar problems while improving educational outcomes for all students. "I'm not here tonight seeking revenge against individuals," Rebecca concluded. "I'm here because I believe Jefferson High School can become a model for how educational institutions should handle harassment and protect vulnerable students. But that requires acknowledging current failures and committing to systemic change." As Rebecca returned to her seat, the auditorium remained silent for several long moments. Her presentation had been so comprehensive and professionally delivered that it was clear she wasn't just a substitute teacher making complaints. She was an expert in institutional reform, presenting a detailed analysis of systemic problems and practical solutions. Chairman Hayes looked grimly at Margaret Bennett and Linda Morrison. "Mrs. Bennett, Mrs. Morrison, you requested time to present concerns about Ms. Thompson's performance. Given what we've just heard, do you still wish to proceed?" Margaret Bennett stood shakily, clearly unprepared for the completely changed dynamics of the meeting. Her carefully prepared attack on Rebecca's competence now seemed petty and vindictive, in light of the serious institutional issues that had just been exposed. "Chairman Hayes, we're obviously dealing with issues that are much more complex than we initially understood," Margaret began, her earlier confidence completely gone. "Perhaps we should postpone our presentation until we've had time to review the evidence Ms. Thompson has presented." It was a complete capitulation. Margaret Bennett, who had arrived expecting to destroy Rebecca's career, was now asking for time to process evidence of her own son's systematic misconduct and her family's role in enabling it. Linda Morrison remained seated, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear. The evidence of her corruption was so clear and well documented that any attempt to defend her actions would only make her legal situation worse. Her political career was effectively over, and her primary concern was now limiting her criminal liability. Patricia Walsh stood to address the board, her voice strong with righteous anger that had been building for months. "Chairman Hayes, I want to thank Ms. Thompson for having the courage to present this evidence. My daughter Jennifer was victimized by these same students last year, and when we tried to get help, we were told we were overreacting and that boys will be boys." She turned to face Margaret Bennett directly. "Mrs. Bennett, your son and his friends nearly drove my daughter to attempt suicide. The only reason we didn't pursue legal action was because school officials assured us the problem would be addressed. Now we see that nothing was done, and other children have suffered the same abuse Jennifer experienced." Other parents began standing to share their own stories. One by one, they described harassment incidents that had been dismissed or minimized, administrative responses that protected perpetrators while blaming victims, and a pattern of institutional failure that had persisted for years. The testimony painted a devastating picture of systematic neglect and corruption that extended far beyond individual cases. Dylan Cruz's mother, Maria, stood near the back of the auditorium. She had been working double shifts as a nurse and had been largely unaware of her son's involvement in the harassment network. Rebecca's investigation had revealed the extent of Dylan's participation, but also his genuine distress about the situation and his desire to find positive alternatives. "I want to apologize to the families whose children my son has hurt," Maria said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I've been so focused on keeping our family together during the divorce that I didn't pay enough attention to what Dylan was doing at school. Ms. Thompson showed me evidence of his involvement, but she also offered him a chance to make things right by helping other students instead of hurting them." She looked directly at Rebecca with gratitude. Instead of just punishing Dylan, Ms. Thompson gave him a path toward redemption. That's the kind of teacher and leader our children deserve. Tyler Bennett and Chase Morrison were both present in the auditorium, sitting with their families and watching their network of protection collapse in real time. Tyler's usual arrogance had been replaced by genuine fear as he realized the legal implications of the evidence Rebecca had presented. Chase looked stunned, clearly unable to process how completely their situation had deteriorated. The most dramatic moment came when Dylan Cruz himself stood up and walked to the microphone. His decision to participate in Rebecca's peer mediation program had given him the courage to publicly acknowledge his role in the harassment and commit to making amends. "My name is Dylan Cruz, and I need to tell everyone what I've done," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "For the past year, I've been part of a group that systematically harassed other students. We targeted kids who couldn't fight back, and we thought it was funny when they suffered." The auditorium was completely silent as Dylan continued his confession. We vandalized Ms. Thompson's classroom, sent threatening messages, and tried to destroy her reputation because she wouldn't let us continue hurting people. Everything she's shown you tonight is true, and it's probably worse than what she's documented." Dylan turned to face the families whose children had been targeted. "I can't undo the damage we've caused, but I want to spend the rest of my time at Jefferson High, helping other students instead of hurting them. Ms. Thompson has given me that opportunity, and I'm going to take it." His public confession and commitment to reform created a powerful moment of accountability that resonated throughout the auditorium. Here was one of the perpetrators taking full responsibility for his actions and committing to positive change under Rebecca's guidance. The board voted unanimously to accept Rebecca's recommendations for comprehensive anti-bullying reform. Linda Morrison resigned from the board effective immediately to focus on her legal defense. Margaret Bennett withdrew all complaints against Rebecca and issued a public apology for her son's conduct. But the most significant outcome was the transformation of Rebecca's role within the district. She was officially appointed as Director of Student Safety and Harassment Prevention, with authority to implement systemic reforms and oversight of all disciplinary decisions involving harassment complaints. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca was surrounded by parents, students, and community members expressing gratitude for her courage and competence. Many commented that they had never seen such a thorough and professional presentation of institutional problems, and several asked about her background in organizational reform. "Ms. Thompson," asked one parent, "where did you learn to investigate and present evidence like this?" "That was more professional than anything I've seen from consultants our company hires." Rebecca smiled quietly. "I spent 12 years as a military officer, including 2 combat deployments where I was responsible for protecting people and solving complex problems under pressure. The skills transfer pretty well to civilian education." The revelation of her military background explained everything to those who had wondered how a substitute teacher could so effectively dismantle a network of harassment and corruption that had operated with impunity for years. Rebecca Thompson wasn't just an educator, she was a combat veteran who had brought military-grade strategic thinking and tactical execution to the challenge of protecting vulnerable students. As the auditorium emptied, Tyler Bennett and Chase Morrison walked past Rebecca with their heads down, no longer the arrogant bullies who had thought they could intimidate a quiet substitute teacher. They were now facing serious disciplinary action, potential criminal charges for some of their digital harassment, and the complete collapse of the social and administrative protection that had enabled their behavior. Rebecca watched them leave with the same professional detachment she had once reserved for defeated enemies. She had achieved total victory, not through violence or personal revenge, but through superior intelligence, strategic planning, and unwavering commitment to protecting those under her command. The war for Jefferson High School was over, and Rebecca Thompson had won it so completely that her opponents never understood what had defeated them until it was far too late to resist. 3 months after the explosive school board meeting that had transformed Jefferson High School, Rebecca Thompson stood in her new office reviewing the comprehensive changes that had swept through the district. The small, cluttered substitute teacher's desk she had once occupied was now replaced by a professional workspace befitting her role as Director of Student Safety and Harassment Prevention. The walls displayed certificates from conflict resolution, organizations, photos from military service, and letters of gratitude from students and families whose lives had been changed by her intervention. The transformation of Jefferson High had been swift and dramatic. Under Rebecca's leadership, the school had implemented the most advanced anti-bullying program in the state, complete with anonymous reporting systems, peer mediation networks, and mandatory training for all staff members. More importantly, the culture had shifted from one that protected privileged harassers to one that genuinely prioritized student safety and educational equity. Tyler Bennett had been transferred to a private military academy in Georgia, where his parents hoped structured discipline would address his behavioral problems. The transition had been difficult for Tyler, who found himself in an environment where his family's influence carried no weight and his past behavior earned him immediate scrutiny from instructors trained to handle troubled adolescents. For the first time in his life, Tyler was experiencing genuine consequences for his actions, and the shock was profound. His mother, Margaret, had quietly withdrawn from all community leadership positions and was focusing her energy on supporting Tyler's rehabilitation. The investigation into her husband's law practice had resulted in significant financial penalties and a suspension of his license to practice, effectively ending the family's position as local power brokers. The Bennetts were learning what it meant to live without the protective network of influence they had taken for granted. Chase Morrison's situation was more serious. The evidence Rebecca had gathered of his online harassment and threats had attracted the attention of federal investigators who discovered that his activities violated several cybercrime statutes. Chase was facing potential criminal charges that could follow him into adulthood, and his mother Linda's legal troubles had eliminated any possibility of administrative protection. Linda Morrison herself was fighting felony corruption charges and civil rights violations related to her misuse of school board authority. The investigation had revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended far beyond protecting her son, including financial irregularities and abuse of power that shocked even her former allies. Her political career was over, and she was facing the possibility of prison time. But the most remarkable transformation involved Dylan Cruz. Under Rebecca's mentorship, Dylan had emerged as one of Jefferson High's most effective peer mediators and student advocates. His personal experience with harassment and family dysfunction had given him unique insights into helping other students navigate similar challenges. Dylan's redemption had become a powerful example of how restorative justice could transform perpetrators into protectors. Rebecca's Tuesday morning was typical of her new routine. She began with a meeting with Jennifer Walsh, who had returned to Jefferson High after transferring to private school the previous year. Jennifer's confidence had been rebuilt through therapy and the knowledge that the harassment network that had targeted her was now completely dismantled. "Miss Thompson, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done," Jennifer said, her voice strong and confident in a way that would have been impossible months earlier. "I know I've said it before, but seeing Dylan leading the peer mediation program and knowing that Tyler and Chase can't hurt anyone else anymore, it's like getting my life back." "You did that yourself, Jennifer," Rebecca replied. "I just helped create conditions where you could heal and other students could be protected. Your courage in speaking up at the board meeting was what really made the difference." Jennifer smiled and pulled out a letter from her backpack. "I wanted to show you this before I turn it in. It's my application essay for the State University Honors Program. I wrote about resilience and advocacy, and how sometimes the worst experiences in our lives can teach us how to help others." Rebecca read the essay with growing pride. Jennifer had written about her harassment experience not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a survivor who had learned to use her pain as motivation for protecting others. The writing was mature, thoughtful, and demonstrated exactly the kind of growth that made Rebecca's career in education meaningful. "This is outstanding work, Jennifer. You've taken a traumatic experience and transformed it into wisdom that will help you make a difference in other people's lives. That's exactly the kind of resilience that will serve you well in college and beyond." Rebecca's next appointment was with Dr. Rodriguez, who had requested a quarterly review of the harassment prevention program's effectiveness. The data they reviewed was remarkable. Reports of bullying incidents had dropped by 70%. Student satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in feelings of safety and belonging, and academic performance had improved across all demographic categories. "Rebecca, these results are extraordinary," Dr. Rodriguez said, reviewing the statistical analysis. The state education department is requesting permission to use Jefferson High as a model for other districts. We've gone from being known as the graveyard for teachers to being recognized as a leader in student safety and educational innovation. The key was addressing systemic problems rather than just individual incidents, Rebecca explained. When we eliminated the corruption that protected certain students from consequences, we created an environment where all students could feel safe reporting problems and seeking help. Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. I have to admit, when you first arrived here, I never imagined you'd end up transforming our entire approach to student safety. Your military background really made the difference, didn't it? Military training taught me how to analyze complex problems, develop strategic solutions, and execute plans under pressure, Rebecca agreed. But more importantly, it taught me that protecting people is a sacred responsibility that requires both competence and courage. Students deserve the same level of protection we provide to soldiers in combat zones. The comparison wasn't hyperbolic. Rebecca's approach to student safety incorporated military concepts of force protection, intelligence gathering, and mission-critical decision-making that were rarely applied in educational settings. The result was a comprehensive system that anticipated problems, responded quickly to threats, and held all personnel accountable for maintaining safe environments. Rebecca's afternoon schedule included a visit to Dylan Cruz's peer mediation session, where he was helping two younger students resolve a conflict over social media posts. Watching Dylan work with these students was one of Rebecca's greatest professional satisfactions, seeing someone who had once used his social intelligence to hurt others now channeling those same skills toward helping and healing. The important thing to remember, Dylan was telling the two middle school students, is that what you post online affects real people with real feelings. I used to think it was funny when people got upset about stuff on social media, but I learned that digital harassment can hurt just as much as physical bullying. One of the students, a shy 7th grader named Marcus, looked up at Dylan with obvious respect. But what if someone starts spreading rumors about you online? How do you handle that without getting in trouble yourself? Dylan's response demonstrated how completely his perspective had changed. The first thing you do is document everything and report it to a trusted adult. Don't try to handle it yourself, because that usually just makes things worse, Ms. Thompson taught me that the best way to deal with bullies is to use systems and support networks, not to fight back alone. Rebecca watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. Dylan's transformation from perpetrator to protector was evidence that even the most troubling behavioral patterns could be changed with proper intervention and guidance. His success was inspiring other former harassers to seek help and make amends for their past actions. The most significant long-term change at Jefferson High was the establishment of the Rebecca Thompson Center for Student Advocacy, a comprehensive support system that provided counseling, conflict resolution, and academic assistance for students facing various challenges. The center was funded through a combination of district resources and private donations from families who had been helped by Rebecca's interventions. The center's programs included peer mediation training, digital citizenship education, family support services, and academic advocacy for students whose performance had been affected by harassment or personal problems. Most importantly, it provided a safe space where students could report concerns without fear of retaliation or dismissal. Rebecca's evening was spent reviewing applications for the center's summer internship program, which would train high school students to become advocates for younger students in their elementary and middle schools. The program was designed to extend the harassment prevention network throughout the district while providing meaningful leadership opportunities for teenagers who wanted to make positive contributions to their communities. One application particularly caught her attention. It was from Sarah Chun, Tommy Chun's younger sister, who had been horrified to learn about her brother's role in the harassment network. Sarah's essay demonstrated genuine understanding of the harm that harassment caused, and a sincere commitment to preventing other students from experiencing what Tyler Chase and Dylan's victims had endured. "I know my family name is associated with some terrible things that happened at Jefferson High," Sarah had written. "But I want to prove that the Chun family can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I want to use my brothers' mistakes as motivation to protect other students and show that people can change and make better choices." Rebecca approved Sarah's application immediately. The girl's willingness to acknowledge her family's role in past problems, while committing to positive change, exemplified exactly the kind of accountability and growth that the harassment prevention program was designed to encourage. As Rebecca prepared to leave her office, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, she had been a substitute teacher trying to avoid conflict and blend into the background. She had attempted to suppress her military training and leadership capabilities in favor of what she thought would be a quieter, simpler civilian career. The harassment campaign launched by Tyler Chase and Dylan had forced her to abandon that approach and embrace the strategic thinking and tactical execution that had made her successful as a military officer. In trying to destroy her, they had inadvertently revealed her true capabilities and provided the motivation she needed to transform not just her own situation but the entire educational environment. Rebecca's personal transformation was as significant as the institutional changes she had implemented. She had learned that her military experience wasn't something to hide or minimize. It was a valuable skill set that could be applied to civilian challenges with remarkable effectiveness. Her ability to analyze complex problems, develop strategic solutions, and execute plans under pressure made her uniquely qualified for educational leadership roles that required both competence and courage. The recognition had come from beyond Jefferson High as well. Rebecca had been invited to speak at state and national education conferences about implementing military-inspired approaches to student safety and institutional reform. Her methods were being studied by researchers and adopted by districts across the country that were struggling with similar harassment and corruption problems. Most importantly, Rebecca had found her true calling. Teaching individual classes had been satisfying, but protecting entire communities of students and creating systems that would prevent future victimization was deeply fulfilling in ways that connected to her fundamental sense of purpose and mission. As she locked her office and walked to her car, Rebecca encountered Tyler Bennett's replacement in the American history class, a quiet, studious girl named Amanda Rivera, whose academic potential had been suppressed for years by fear of harassment. Under the new safety protocols, Amanda was flourishing academically and socially, earning recognition for both her scholarly achievements and her contributions to peer mediation efforts. "Good evening, Miss Thompson," Amanda said respectfully. "I wanted to let you know that I got accepted into the honors program for next year." "That's wonderful news, Amanda. You've worked very hard and you deserve this recognition. I also wanted to thank you for making it possible for students like me to succeed here. Before you came, I was always afraid to speak up in class or get involved in activities because I didn't want to become a target. Now I feel safe being myself and pursuing my goals." Rebecca smiled with deep satisfaction. Amanda's transformation represented the ultimate success of the harassment prevention program, creating an environment where all students could reach their full potential without fear of intimidation or retaliation. As Rebecca drove home, she thought about the letter she had received that morning from her former commanding officer in Afghanistan. He had read about her work at Jefferson High in a military publication and wanted to congratulate her on applying military leadership principles to civilian education challenges. "Captain Thompson," he had written, "your success at Jefferson High School demonstrates exactly the kind of adaptability and mission focus that made you such an effective officer. You've proven that the leadership skills we develop in military service can be used to protect and serve communities in peacetime, just as effectively as they serve our nation in combat." Your students are fortunate to have a guardian who understands that education is a mission-critical operation that requires the same level of strategic thinking and tactical execution that we apply to military objectives. The letter had validated Rebecca's decision to embrace her military background rather than hiding it. She was no longer a substitute teacher pretending to be someone else. She was Captain Rebecca Thompson, using her combat-tested leadership abilities to protect students and transform educational institutions. 6 months after 3 teenage bullies had thought they could humiliate and destroy a quiet substitute teacher, Jefferson High School had become a model for how educational institutions should address harassment, protect vulnerable students, and hold all community members accountable for maintaining safe learning environments. Tyler Bennett was learning discipline and accountability at Military Academy. Chase Morrison was facing the criminal justice system and discovering that actions have lasting consequences. Dylan Cruz was using his experiences to help other students avoid the mistakes he had made. Most importantly, hundreds of students who might have become victims of harassment were now protected by comprehensive systems that prevented intimidation and provided support for those who needed help. Rebecca Thompson had not only defended herself against her attackers, she had created a legacy of protection that would benefit students for generations to come. The quiet substitute teacher had turned out to be exactly what Jefferson High School needed: a combat veteran who understood that protecting people was worth any personal cost, and who possessed the strategic thinking and tactical capabilities necessary to win battles that others couldn't even see clearly enough to fight. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.